Distinguished delegates, could you please take your seats so that we can start?
Okay, we put the link here.
The first thing I'd like to make an announcement, and just to inform you that every single minute of our proceedings here is being recorded and is on YouTube. Yesterday's YouTube version had like 6 or 7 hours of our deliberations here. So the whole deliberations are being recorded on YouTube. So you can watch yourselves and see how you performed on YouTube. Okay. This morning, and I think the link is now being displayed. Yes. This morning, before we begin our work today, I would like to inform you that an open space discussion titled Towards Provision of Effective Remedies and a Reparatory Justice will be held this afternoon from 1 p.m. to 3 p.m. in room 27. It will be moderated by Ms. Verenice Shepherd, member of the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. Interpretation will be provided. We now move on this morning. We did have a number of civil society speakers on our list under recognition. Yesterday we exhausted the list on justice, so we are now going on to complete the list on recognition before we go on to our final theme, which is justice. So I will just try to go down this list now and would ask the speakers to identify themselves and to give us 2-minute statement each. So on that note, I will start off from where my colleague left off yesterday, and I would call the European Network of People of African Descent to make their statement under recognition. Is there, do we have the presence here?
I think it's European, it's Michael.
Yes, Michael, it's you, no? It's you? The European Network of People of African Descent. Yes. You have the floor, sir.
Yes, it is. Okay. Yes. Thank you, Ambassador, for giving me the floor. And good morning, everyone. I was actually the last speaker yesterday, so I gave my statement yesterday. So thanks a lot. I will be giving another statement this afternoon, though. Thank you.
So I will call on NPAD PAG/PAG.
Yes. My name is Omar Ba from INPAD Network, and I would like to address this question of recognition. I think that the decade, it has been now 3 years since the decade came in, and the member states, a lot of member states failed to address a recognition and make a public declaration about this decade. And I think that when I see how they go along with this, it's like the artwork in the front of the UN building, which is a chair with 3 foot and 1 missing foot. And they expect us to sit on that. So, and all we know is if you sit on that, you're going to fall. So I mean by this that I think that it's the time now today that the member states, if they really, because they unanimously voted for the recognition of this decade, so they have to apply this, and by making a public declaration that this decade, that they take it seriously, and that they want all the different institutions to implement this on different levels, seen in economics, seen in culture, seen in politics. So by this too, I want to address to the question to say that today all the nations are desolated about what is happening in Libya, but if they keep on denying the importance of looking at the situation of people of African descent in the world, what happening is in Libya will happen the next year and on and on and on, in different countries, on different forms, and we will still be talking about this. So my appeal is to the member states: recognize the decade, implement it, and make concrete declaration and help civil society to make things change. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. The next speaker on my list is Cross Culture International Foundation. Could you please identify yourself? Cross Culture International Foundation, not here? No, I'll move on to the next. Echoing IDA.
All right, good morning, and thank you to the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights and coordinator of the International Decade for People of African Descent. And thank you for the opportunity to provide comments today. My name is Elizabeth Dawes-Gay, and I'm here on behalf of Echoing IDA, which is a program of Forward Together that amplifies the voices of Black women on racial, social, and reproductive justice in the United States. Echoing IDA is home to thought leaders, skilled communicators, and truth tellers living the legacy of American activist and journalist Ida B. Wells Barnett, who notably documented the lynching and lawless killing of Black people in the American South at great risk to her own life. We at Echoing IDA tell the stories that some would rather see left untold, and that often go ignored by popular media. Those stories of the real experiences of Black people, our families, and our communities. As a truth teller and writer, I work to bring attention to the extreme racial disparities in maternal health outcomes in the United States, and to inform stakeholders about the reasons why, nationally, Black women are 3 to 4 times more likely to die from pregnancy-related causes. This disparity is greater in some parts of the U.S. For example, evidence from New York City reveals that Black women are 12 times more likely to die from pregnancy-related causes than their white counterparts. This racial disparity in maternal health outcomes remains even when income and education are accounted for. Lack of consistent access to high-quality, appropriate care certainly contributes to poor maternal health outcomes in the Black community. But when we take a closer look, we find that systemic racism and racial discrimination takes a significant toll on our health in a variety of ways. Racist policies and systems in the U.S. impede our financial and physical access to preventive health care. They create pockets of poverty and blight, restrict our community's economic growth, sustain food deserts, and work to put Black youth in prison or in their graves instead of keeping them in school. Researchers have well documented that the stress and trauma of living while Black in the U.S. disrupts biological processes necessary for healthy pregnancy outcomes. These racist policies and systems set us up to fail, and they are killing Black mothers. But no woman should die while bringing life into the world. I also serve as chair of the steering committee of the Black Mamas Matter Alliance, a new Black woman-led effort in the U.S. working to achieve our vision of a world where Black mamas have the rights, respect, and resources to thrive before, during, and after pregnancy. We center the voices, experiences, and needs of Black mamas to advance policy, cultivate meaningful research, enhance holistic care, and redirect and reframe the conversation on Black maternal health. I call on the U.S. government to recognize the role of racism in Black maternal health outcomes and to make a serious effort to address this life or death issue. I also call on the U.S. government to listen to Black women, to trust Black women, acknowledge our truths, recognize and support our leadership, and act to right those wrongs caused by centuries of racism and racial discrimination. The U.S. can and it must do better. Thank you.
Yes, I thank you for that statement. That was Echoing IDA?
She's not.
Oh, she's gone. I now give the floor to Black Mamas Matter Alliance. Can you please identify yourself?
Yes, right here. I just want to make sure, can you hear me on the microphone? Okay, great. Greetings to the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights and coordinator of the International Decade for People of African Descent. My name is Angela Doinsala Aina, and I am a public health professional and a Black maternal justice advocate, and also a first-generation American, a daughter of two immigrants from Nigeria. I'm here representing the Black Mamas Matter Alliance to raise the alarm of the high numbers of maternal deaths experienced by Black women in the US and also globally. The growing number of deaths and complications to women in pregnancy and childbirth in the United States is a human rights crisis. The US is only one of 17 countries worldwide with an advanced economy where the rate of maternal mortality is rising. When the maternal mortality data was first collected by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and compiled by national databases in the 1940s, Black women were twice as likely to die from pregnancy-related complications then. However, even now, from the 1990s all the way to the 2000s, Black women are now 4 times as likely to die from pregnancy complications. What's even more sobering is that Black infants are more likely to be stillborn and die in their first year of life than white infants. These racial disparities exist across income and education levels, and we know that this is due to structural racism, gender oppression, and social determinants of health inequities experienced by Blacks in America. And these are the contributing factors that intensify the dismal health statistics of Black women's maternal health outcomes in the US. This is why we must support alliances like the Black Mamas Matter Alliance. BMMA promotes a human rights-based approach to eliminating racial disparities in maternal health. We seek governmental accountability for implementing human rights standards related to sexual, reproductive, and maternal health, and recognize that racial disparities in maternal health are part of the broader pattern of structural racism, gender oppression, and human rights violations experienced by people of African descent. BMMA is requesting that the U.S. government, first and foremost, recognizes this issue and makes a serious investment in Black women's leadership, our maternity care work, and in our ingenuity in solving the problems that impact our communities. Finally, we ask that the U.S. government, including its medical and public health systems, review and adapt our policy toolkit, which is on our website, and make a real investment in Black women's maternity care and implement it on the federal and on the state levels, and promote affordable, comprehensive, and holistic maternal health care that is free of gender and racial discrimination. We thank you for the opportunity to speak today. Thank you.
And thank you for speaking. The next speaker on my list is HELP Organization, H-E-L-P Organization. Could you please identify yourself and take the floor? No, I don't see HELP Organization around. I'll move then to the next speaker, which is Tapepuka or Tepuka. Tapepuka. Could you please identify yourself and take the floor? Yes, madam.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and for according me this opportunity to speak this morning. My name is Chawa, and I'm from Tapepuka. I introduced myself yesterday. And today I'm going to take the opportunity to say we are concerned as grassroots organizations that member states are not really bringing the issue of the decade, the provisions of the decade. They are not raising awareness for the people that matter at grassroots level. It is all being left to grassroots organizations to do that piece of work without any resources, like I was saying yesterday. And our other concern is related to the issues of evidence in terms of what happens to people who are arriving in initial accommodation. the levels of systemic injustice and racism against people of African descent and people and Africans are so atrocious. It's whilst our evidence is considered anecdotal, we ask whether it needs rigorous research to establish that 3 toilets are not sufficient for 300 to 400 people. Poor conditions in initial accommodation. I apologize, Madam Chairperson, because I wasn't expecting to speak again, so I'm a little bit disorganized.
60 seconds left. Your mic is not on. Mic is not on.
Sorry. Oh, my apologies again.
Go on to the next speaker, and then maybe if you you could make an intervention under the next item. I now give the floor to SOS Racism. Could you please identify yourself? SOS Racism. No? Okay. Yes. Oh. No, I give the floor to the next speaker because you exhausted most of your 2 minutes. Can we have the next speaker? We'll see at the end if you can complete it. SOS Racism? No? We then give the floor to Black Women's Blueprint. Yes, you have the floor, madam.
Okay. Thank you. Greetings, my name is Farah Tanis, and I am the Executive Director of Black Women's Blueprint, a national feminist and women's human rights organization anchored in New York, USA. Thank you for the opportunity to address the UN today at this regional meeting for the International Decade for People of African Descent. Black Women's Blueprint issued the first ever report to the UN CERD Committee to address gendered forms of racism, rape, and sexual assault against Black women in the US in 2014, and gave testimony to the UN Committee Against Torture here in Geneva in 2015 on the impact of police sexual misconduct against Black women and girls in the US. A full analysis and an explicit recognition of gender, sexuality, and in particular the systematic rape and forced reproductive labor imposed on Black women's bodies under chattel slavery for the purpose of profit and the ensuing intergenerational trauma and consequences must be integral to the goals and the work of the decade. Gender and the legacy of the slave trade and racist, misogynist ideologies about women of African descent are still ingrained in the United States policy and state practices, and overall shorter life expectancy, as well as the fact that Black women comprise a third to half of intimate partner homicides, while we only are just 13% of the U.S. population, higher infant and maternal mortality, threats to access to health care, and in particular the elimination of reproductive health care in parts of the U.S., the undeniable cyclical relationship between violence against women, including trans-identified women, and poverty continues to jeopardize U.S. Black women's economic well-being, undermines our pursuit of education, decreasing our earning potential and stability throughout the course of our lifetimes, often leading to homelessness, mental health, and other health care. I also highlight the sexual abuse to prison pipeline faced by Black girls, the higher rates of incarcerations for Black women, and the prevalence of law enforcement and sexual abuse against Black women and girls. Our recommendations make special reference to gender rights within the decade. We call on the U.S. to recognize the 2016 National Truth and Reconciliation Commission on Sexual Assault convened by Black women in the United States. We call on the U.S. to issue an apology for the centuries of state-sanctioned rape, forced labor, forced reproduction, sterilization, and other abuses of Black women's bodies, end gender-biased policing practices, and the overcriminalization of Black girls, which is tantamount to enslavement. And lastly, we call on the U.S. to maintain temporary protected status for immigrants from Haiti and implement a pathway to citizenship for millions of undocumented immigrants living in the United States from various African nations, the Caribbean, and Latin America. Policies explicitly guaranteeing the human rights of vulnerable communities can save lives. Never forget the special case of Black women and girls. Thank you.
I thank you for that intervention. And now, next speaker on my list is Centro Panafricano. Could you please identify yourself? Centro Panafricano. There's nobody? Okay. I go on to the next speaker, which is Pembroke House. Yeah. Yes, you have the floor, madam.
Hello? Oh, yeah. Thank you for, can you hear me? Oh, thank you for giving me the floor. So social and cultural rights are given a cursory nod in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights under Article 24 and Article 27, but an overarching and increasingly unsettling realization has dawned on me since engaging with the United Nations, and that is that social and cultural rights are last on its list of priorities, but they are pertinent to me for two reasons. I currently deliver national programs across the United Kingdom that help young people and local communities gain access to the creative industries via work, education and training. I collaborate with an array of creative organisations so that young people are supported into these hard-to-reach industries with peer mentoring, media masterclasses and employability workshops. But social and cultural rights also matter to me, as my parents and grandparents came to the UK via the English and Spanish-speaking Caribbean, and like most people of African descent who hail from the Americas, my ancestors were exploited for their labour via the transatlantic slave trade. And through this, I understand that when an individual or group is subjugated and oppressed, one of the first human rights violations to occur are the decimating of cultural and social rights. Names are stripped, religious freedoms denied, art destroyed and cultural monuments destructed, and these violations are occurring in parts of the world as I speak. I heard many people yesterday speak about the museums being established and the cultural monuments erected to recognise people of African descent in their countries, but actually I'm from a country where creative and cultural monuments aren't just nice places to visit or pay homage. They generate £84.1 billion per year for the UK, so that's £10 million an hour. I'm conscious that I'm running out of time. My overarching point is that recognising social and cultural rights, recognising the contributions of people of African descent, especially in the diaspora, goes far beyond building a museum or erecting a cultural monument. It's recognising their contributions through fair employment and fair access to the creative industries. It's getting them involved in creative work, and it's also understanding the social and cultural rights are pertinent, and in order for that to happen, the United Nations needs to lead by example, and it needs to make social and cultural rights its priority.
Yes, thank you for that statement. And next speaker on my list is the National Monument Dutch Slavery Past. Could you please identify yourself?
Yes, can you hear me? Okay. Thank you very much. Good morning, Chairperson, and the others here. Thank you for this opportunity to speak. I here today represent the Dutch National Monument Slavery Past, which lobbied successfully for the establishment of a monument commemorating the victims of the Dutch colonial history. I also represent here today the recently established National Forum for Civil Society of People of African Descent in the Netherlands. This organization aims to be an umbrella organization for the Dutch civil society and has two goals. The first is to consolidate the various voices of the diaspora, and the second is to create an academic research institution for our people. However, one of the main challenges that we are currently facing in the Netherlands is that the Dutch government does not care to genuinely recognize the real voice of our people. Ladies and gentlemen, we cannot ever successfully implement the UN decade if the government does not listen to the voices of the people for which the decade is meant. if they do not actively and deeply engage us, the people of African descent, for who are they implementing what? Ladies and gentlemen, today here I make an appeal to the governments to sincerely recognize and listen to the voices of our people, and I call upon the civil society to leave behind the infighting and band together. If we do not do it ourselves, nobody is going to do this for us. I thank you.
And thank you very much for keeping within the time frame. The next speaker on my list is Manchester Metropolitan University. Could you please identify yourself? Manchester Metropolitan University. Yes.
Great. Can you hear me, everyone? Fantastic. Thank you, Madam Moderator, and a very good morning to you. Many thanks for allowing me briefly to set out my suggestions for this recognition session. So my name is Ornette Clennon, and I am a critical race scholar from Manchester Metropolitan University in the United Kingdom. I would like to suggest that the working group and the Secretariat considers the development of robust reporting mechanisms for grassroots educational activities. We need to find ways of internationally recognizing grassroots community efforts to present counter-narratives that aim to illuminate structural discrimination, in so doing, deconstructing our colonial legacies. In the UK, we have African Diaspora Saturday Schools, who are community-based organisations, and today I also represent the Manchester-based Saturday School Consortium called Making Education a Priority, MEEP for short. Our community schools work tirelessly to address the gaps in mainstream education provision. I suggest that we think very, very carefully about how we can harmonise their outputs with the Sustainable Development Goals, especially SDG 4. With a nod towards the justice theme, this matter of community SDG monitoring is very important because to effect real change, agency has to be a bottom-up process with the full engagement and leadership of both civil society and grassroots organisations. So, to house my recommendations, I suggest that the UN supports the formation of an international civil society and grassroots network for people of African descent with an online platform. Amongst other items, this platform should include a searchable international database on CSOs and grassroots organisations with information about their organisation, their interests, and their SDG-mapped community reports that detail their efforts to counter colonial narratives in their mainstream educational systems. Thank you.
I thank you for that statement. The last speaker on my list on the recognition is the Creole Descendants Union International. Could you please identify yourself? You have the floor, madam.
Madam Chair, thank you for giving me the opportunity to make a statement on behalf of the Creole Descendants Union International. My name is Rosamond Luke. The Creoles of Sierra Leone comprise of 4 distinct groups, having their roots in transatlantic slave trade between 15th and 17th century. These groups, descendants of enslaved Africans, were known as the Black Poor, the Nova Scotians, the Maroons, and the Liberated Africans. Even though the recorded history of these groups is scanty, it is clear that these groups of people, victims of the transatlantic slave trade, have not been given the attention they deserve internationally. In fact, very little is known about these groups, and their plights are rarely included in the literature on transatlantic slave trade. They may be small in number, but the peculiarities of their story provide an important reason for them not to be left out of any studies on the subject or indeed in history. One particular group of Creoles are the Nova Scotians. They were enslaved Africans who were Black loyalists who fought on the side of the British during the American War of Independence. After the war, They were transferred by boat to the province of Nova Scotia and promised inter alia access to land, which they never got and were forced to work as indentured servants. A number of them who had not signed contract as indentured servants were then taken back to Africa, but families were split in the process. The Maroons were also taken to Nova Scotia, and some of the numbers were also eventually settled in Sierra Leone, where I was born and raised. The Creole Descendants Union International would like to take this opportunity to appeal to UNESCO and other stakeholders to include their groups of enslaved Africans and the historical sites related to Creoles in the Slave Route Project and other activities aimed at the recognition of people of African descent. Finally, Madam Chair, the Creole descendants in Canada would also like to acknowledge with gratitude the recent steps taken in Nova Scotia to address some of the problems faced by the people of African descent in Nova Scotia, including access to title deeds to land, and would also like to encourage that efforts be intensified to ensure that all their human rights are respected. Thank you.
I thank you for that statement. Is there anybody else who would like to take the floor under recognition? No, I don't see anybody indicating to take the floor. So on that note, I'd like to thank you all for your contribution to the debate under recognition. The panel, I think, did round up yesterday, but I'd like to also encourage all the speakers to make sure that their written statements are sent to the Secretariat if they really want their views to be reflected in the outcome of this conference. So I encourage each and every speaker today to make sure that their statements are sent to the OHCHR for record purposes. Now, and on that note, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I would now give the floor. We would now go to the last theme of our meeting, and the third theme of the International Decade, which is development. Let me welcome Ambassador Echi Taongo Mushayawanhu. I hope it is acceptable. The pronunciation is acceptable. I'm chairperson of the ad hoc committee on the elaboration of complementary standards, who will moderate a discussion today. I ask him to the podium and I hand over to him. You have to call them. You don't have scenario? Distinguished delegates, we are starting a bit early, so we are still missing one member of the panel, but we are going to start anyway. So I'll hand the floor to the moderator, and we will then catch up. So you have the floor, sir. The floor is all yours.
Good morning, colleagues. Let's start our session. And as has been said by the chair of this conference, my name is Taonga Mshayavanu. I'm the ambassador of Zimbabwe and also the chair of the ad hoc committee on the elaboration of complementary standards. Colleagues, the International Decade of People of African Descent provides an international framework for us all to unite around. National governments, that is the United Nations system, private sector, and civil society. It is an agenda agreed to by member states to allow for more focused and sustained action to address the situation of people of African descent everywhere. This morning, our panel will consider the third theme of the decade, which is development. According to the program of activities, states should adopt measures aimed at guaranteeing active, free, and meaningful participation by all individuals, including people of African descent, in development and decision-making related to it and in fair distribution of the resulting benefits. Poverty is both a cause and consequence of discrimination. As such, states should, as appropriate, adopt or strengthen national programs for eradicating poverty and reducing social exclusion that take account of specific needs and experiences of people of African descent. In addition, there has been a historical neglect and lack of public investment in neighborhoods and regions where people of African descent live. I think it has been quite evident this morning in most of your contributions that this is indeed the case. The rapid development and globalization of our societies is such that those historically excluded and marginalized are being left even further behind. Goal 10 of the Sustainable Development Goals is aimed at reducing inequality within and among countries. The SDG targets of empowering and promoting the social, economic, and political inclusion of all, irrespective of age, sex, disability, race, ethnicity, origin, religion, or economic or other status, and ensuring equal opportunity and reducing inequalities of outcome, including by eliminating discriminatory laws, policies, and practices, and promoting appropriate legislation, policies, and action which are completely consistent with the ethos and activities of the decade. States are also to take concrete measures to ensure that public and private education systems do not discriminate against or exclude children of African descent. They should also take measures to eliminate racial discrimination against people of African descent in employment and housing, and improve the access to quality health services. Addressing all these issues and others under this rubric of development is the distinguished panel that I have here, which comprises of somebody still to come, Vereen Shepherd, who is a member of the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. And with me to my right is Ms. Tena Smonovich N. Walter. She's the chairperson, executive board of the European Network of Equality Bodies, Equinet. And we also have Ms. Tenjiwe Tameka McHarris, co-founder of Blackbird. And Mr. Hilary Sobers, who is the human rights specialist with the IACHR and representative of the Special Rapporteurship of People of African Descent and Against Racial Discrimination. We also have, by video, recorded video message, Tendai Achiume, who is the newly appointed Special Rapporteur on contemporary forms of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerances. So without taking any further time, I will now give time to the distinguished panel to debate this issue. So I'll start now with Tina Snomovich-Ernwalter to take the floor. Tina, you have the floor.
Okay. I want to start by saying that I am embarrassed, sad, and mad that in the 21st century, in 2017, we need to speak about racism and racial discrimination in Europe. At the same time, I feel even worse that I need to say that from the point of view of equality bodies, we seem to be having a situation which is not turning better, but worse. We are seeing a rise in racist hate speech, a rise in racial discrimination, a rise in hate crimes. And it's not happening only in Europe, of course, it's happening globally. We've heard from many speakers speak about the auctioning off of people happening in the world of today. I'm sure you will all agree that this is totally and completely not acceptable. In order to do my part, and we all have to do better, I will try and show you the trends, challenges, and priorities from the perspective of equality bodies, but also I will try to give some concrete proposals for ways forward. Now, first, let me explain very briefly what equality bodies are. Equality bodies are public institutions which exist in all EU member states and some European countries outside of the European Union as well, within the wider Europe. The Council of Europe also includes these specialized bodies for prohibition of racism and racial discrimination. And these are bodies which are not governmental bodies, but they're not NGOs either. They are established by legislation, sometimes even by constitutional text. They are financed from the state budget, but they are independent from the government, which means that they are in a position to also critique the governments. They are in a position to recommend to governments. They are in a position to dialogue with governments in a constructive way. What is the role of these bodies? They have many roles. Some of them are multi-mandate bodies, some of them are single-mandate bodies, but all of them at least have a responsibility to fight racial discrimination, and they do so by various types of activities, by doing research, by doing promotion, by doing awareness raising, by looking at individual cases, whether it be deciding in cases or being involved in strategic litigation, so taking cases to court or taking part in court cases. All very important because they are in daily contact with people facing discrimination. Now, what we are also seeing from the equality bodies, and that's seen in Equinet's report, and Equinet, of course, I failed to mention, is a network of these equality bodies, and it includes 46 equality bodies from 34 European countries. So quite a big network covering a large part of Europe. Equinet's report on discrimination based on race or ethnic origin, published in 2006, shows that equality bodies across Europe have recorded a significant rise in race discrimination, hate speech, and hate crime related to race. Negative media coverage and political speeches occurring more and more. There is an increase in state action against refugees and migrants. The language of the mass media and hate speech on social networks was also highlighted as a growing problem. Now, while we can say some of these negative developments were triggered with the arrival of a large number of refugees and migrants to Europe, which was then picked up by hate mongers in mass media and on social networks, the effects go clearly beyond recent refugees and migrants, and we're seeing increasing hostility and discrimination towards racial and ethnic minorities in general. Now, reports from equality bodies also show that institutional discrimination is common around Europe. So we're not speaking about isolated incidents of discrimination. The political, legal, and societal systems in general have a bias against racial and ethnic minorities, and in particular, people of African descent. Now, against this reality, what we see as equality bodies as a hugely problematic issue are high levels of underreporting. So only a fraction of discrimination incidents actually reach equality bodies or authorities. When somebody asks, so how much discrimination is there in a particular country or in a particular region, you can think of it as a pyramid, as a triangle. On top of the triangle, you see the cases where the courts or equality bodies have established discrimination. Then a bit lower, closer to the base, but still on top, you see cases where discrimination was reported to equality bodies, or cases were taken to courts even though discrimination wasn't established. That doesn't mean to say there wasn't any discrimination. Maybe it was very difficult to prove it. But then the whole big base of the triangle, the dark numbers, are the numbers of cases which were never reported. Now, when we ask people who report, when research is being conducted, why you did not report discrimination to anybody, why did you not report? They say, we didn't think anything would change. And that's really a horrible thing to think about. But also there are other issues. Fear of victimization, fear that there will be reprisal, whether it be by your boss in employment or, somewhere else. But there's also the lack of trust in the institutions. Because if you were wronged once, or if somebody you know has been wronged by an institution, you will probably not turn to another institution. But also there is the lack of awareness and the lack of knowledge of the existing mechanisms and where to turn. Now, one additional issue I need to mention is the intersecting forms of discrimination, where we see particularly women, but also men and younger men when we're speaking about various issues being targeted. Now, it is also true that equality bodies recognize that people of African descent are disproportionately affected by poverty as a result of both historic and contemporary discrimination. And then this poverty and socioeconomic status itself lead to further discrimination, so a vicious cycle is created. And we see that also in relation to the fields of education, employment, healthcare, and housing. For instance, a FRA, EU Agency for Fundamental Rights survey, the last one, showed that migrant pupils face some form of school segregation in around 1/2 of EU member states. What we see also in healthcare, as was mentioned yesterday by the High Commissioner, particularly relates to women, so there is intersecting discrimination there, but also when it comes to employment and housing. In housing, we're also still seeing cases of individual landlords refusing to rent apartments to people with a foreign-sounding name, even saying that, like a situation, like an example we've had with our equality body in France, where a situation testing activity via telephone showed a landlord saying that he only wanted European people, like the Swedish or Germans, but not people from North Africa or Africa in general. The French equality body was able to settle this case, and the apartment owner was fined. We're also seeing in many other countries, for instance, in Great Britain, the equality body reported that someone born in an ethnic minority household in Scotland is nearly 4 times more likely to be in a household that is overcrowded and up to twice as likely to be living in poverty and experiencing unemployment. Now, while we know social rights need to be achieved progressively and depending on how much resource there is, what is definitely not acceptable is discrimination in access to social rights. And of course, in tackling discrimination in the systems of education, employment, healthcare, and housing, we must recognize that EU countries represent one of the richest regions of the world, and they hold a historic responsibility for delivering rights and equality for people of African descent. Now, what are the ways forward from the perspective of equality bodies? One is to collect data. Without data, we cannot design effective policies, and we cannot measure whether the policies are producing effect. Of course, data needs to be used and protected in an appropriate way, according, again, to EU law. Secondly, we need to put in place effective and appropriate positive action measures. Even if some might raise concerns that positive action can be difficult to implement and can lead to complaints from the majority population, from the non-beneficiaries, that is not a reason why not to have good positive action measures. Thirdly, we need to tackle underreporting by raising awareness about the legal protection against discrimination, available remedies, also increasing the visibility of equality bodies and other structures providing protection. And for this, we need to conduct better and more effective outreach activities, preferably close to the communities. But that relates more to campaigning and awareness raising on the short term. On the longer term, we need to educate against stereotypes. So teach about values. We also, as number 5, need to train professionals. As we heard yesterday, the conventions, EU legislation, it's all really applied at the national level. And then it's not only about the legal professionals, it's about every single professional knowing what it translates to in terms of their daily jobs. So not only every police officer, but every social worker, every nurse needs to be aware of what this means for their particular job and their everyday work. 6 is strategic litigation. Even though legal cases can only do so much, and it's about wider structural measures, legal cases can also have this spillover effect, which we achieve through strategic litigation, but we need more of it. We need more people being brave enough to come forward and starting legal cases of race discrimination against those who discriminated against them. Number 7, in order to have that, we need to strengthen the equality framework. The NGOs, which need to have the capacity and the resources in order to do that sort of strategic litigation, but also awareness raising and so on, but also equality bodies. And number 8, finally, I cannot emphasize enough the importance of cooperation. Cooperation with people of African descent and their representatives, with stakeholders, with international organizations. And for that reason, it is even more important, and that's why I want to thank the organizers for inviting Equinet to be here and for me to be able to speak to you today. Finally, I just want to say that I think every single person has a responsibility to act. But we here, in our various roles, be it representatives of governments, be it NGOs, be it representatives of international organizations, have a particular responsibility, because we have an opportunity to do something, to produce change. Let's use it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tena from Equinet, for that contribution. You have made many important highlights, including the issues of institutional racism. I think we've heard this quite a lot against people of African descent in Europe, and also the lack of reporting, some of it due to fear of recrimination, and some of it due to lack of awareness. And also you have come up with some concrete recommendations, which is quite positive, 8 of them. So I hope that colleagues will consider those as we debate this issue. So now to make the next contribution is somebody with a first name that's very familiar to our part of the world in Southern Africa. That's Tenjiwe Tameika McHarris. Tenjiwe, you have the floor.
Good morning. Thank you, Chairperson, for the opportunity to speak, but a special thank you to the Black people in the room. It's always very powerful to be surrounded by Black people around the world who are choosing to resist. So thank you. Can you hear me? Fantastic. As was mentioned earlier, I'm the co-founder of Blackbird, but I am also an organizer within the Movement for Black Lives, a united front which includes 50 organizations across the country in the United States. I'm going to start my remarks today by sharing that I disagree and am concerned with the remarks shared by the United States government yesterday. While I and many may agree that there has been some progress for Black people in the United States, of course much of this is due to the labor of social movements, the United States government, whether it be through the law, through policy, or government practices, still continue to undervalue, disrespect, and violate Black lives. That has been true for generations and is especially true under this current administration. At least 43 to 45 million people are living in poverty in the United States today. The poverty rate for Black people in particular is almost double that of the national average. And as such, our people continue to be of the poorest groups in the U.S. along with our indigenous brothers and sisters. Unfortunately, the numbers are even worse for our children. At least a third of all Black children are living in poverty today. That means that Black children are 3 times more likely to live in poverty than white children. While popular culture might lead many to assume that Black people in America are gaining financial stability and wealth, the truth is that the vast majority of our people continue to suffer from a lack of resources and economic instability. Whether they are poor, living paycheck to paycheck, or criminalized because of their debt. This is not true just because we are excluded from the economy, but rather the economy has always been designed to extract from us what it can to benefit and build the wealth of a few. With regards to access to quality education, state and local spending on prisons and jails have increased at triple the rate of funding for public education for preschool through grade 12 in the last 3 decades, and makes plain that those in government are more concerned with incarcerating Black people than educating them. In addition to funding, there exist additional factors that affect quality of education for Black children, specifically racial bias, which is often manifested in school discipline and what our children are taught. Many Black children suffer from an education that does not speak to their history, their experience, or their culture. Our children deserve to know they carry with them a long and powerful history. Black children are treated with harsher levels of discipline. This has been most alarming recently in the case of Black girls who are getting expelled, suspended, criminalized, and over-policed while being denied actual safety and quality education. In South Carolina, a Black girl was aggressively slammed to the ground and dragged across the classroom by an officer who was known for, in quote, unfairly and recklessly targeting African-American students because of a federal lawsuit filed 2 years prior. In Illinois, Jaima Rickman, who has autism, was handcuffed, arrested, and held in custody for 2 hours by the Illinois Police Department. She was 8 years old at the time. With regards to health, Black people die at higher rates than our white counterparts. Black people continue to be vulnerable to cancer, heart attack, diabetes, HIV, and AIDS, maternal and infant mortality as well. Even with the Affordable Care Act, there are still millions of Black people living without health care in the United States today. For those that have health care, we find that many of our people do not have access to culturally competent health care. Furthermore, if you are a Black woman, a Black LGBTQ person, and especially a trans person, to live at the intersections means that the likelihood that if you are not wealthy, it is very difficult to get the care you actually need. Despite even these shortcomings of our current system, our people will be even more threatened if the Trump healthcare agenda is successful, as it seeks to undermine what little healthcare we actually do have. On the issue of employment, recent studies have conducted research on hiring practices and examined hiring discrimination from 1989 through 2015, have concluded that anti-Black racism in hiring is unchanged since at least 1989. Based on their research, while being equally qualified, Black people are still unable to have the same ability to access employment. Furthermore, employment rates amongst Black people continue to be double that of white people, which has gone unchanged for over 60 years. This is not just the result of a difference in education, as even when our people have college degrees, they're still locked out of the workforce. And when not locked out, our community is paid less and with harsher work conditions. This is especially true for Black women who continue to have high rates of unemployment, discriminated on the grounds of race and gender, and are forced to work part-time or a number of short-term jobs as a means to survive. Given the role that Black women historically play in our communities, this does not just impact Black women themselves, but the families they care for and the communities that they hold together. I cannot speak of all this without speaking about how Black women specifically are under attack by and because of everything that has been mentioned before, but also Black women in the U.S. continue to be vulnerable to sexual assault, harassment, domestic abuse, and various forms of violence. The decade must address how women, cis and trans women, are affected by anti-Blackness and patriarchy. As opposed to addressing the ways in which our communities are under-resourced, discriminated against, and suffering, Black people are caged, over-policed, and surveilled. We are overrepresented in local, state, and federal facilities, and private corporations are making profit off of the labor of those incarcerated. Our Black immigrant family in particular are not only further discriminated against with regards to employment, housing, and education, they are targeted and threatened with incarceration and deportation. I'm going to close soon, because what I've shared is only a few facts about the ways in which anti-Blackness continues to operate in the United States, and the ways in which our community is suffering as a result of policies, laws, and practices that has its roots in chattel slavery, patriarchy, and the dehumanization of Black people. But our people are also resisting. We are not just making demands, but fighting at various levels to change culture, laws, institutions, and remove those in positions of power who refuse to acknowledge our needs. We are also working together to create a vision, debate over demands, and identify what policies can allow for transformative reforms. We are also fighting to not only address individual issues, but call for an end to the institutions that create them. Really briefly, I'm going to speak to what we call the Vision for Black Lives, Policy Demands for Black Power, Freedom, and Justice. This is a collection of demands that was created by the Movement for Black Lives. These demands call for the following. 1, divestment from exploitative forces, including prisons, fossil fuels, police, surveillance, and investments in the education, health, and safety of Black people. 2, economic justice for all and a reconstruction of the economy to ensure Black communities have collective ownership, not just access. 3, the right to practice the building of independent Black political power and Black self-determination in all areas of society. This means we are calling for the release of all political prisoners, from Mutulu Shakur to Josh Williams. Josh Williams, a Ferguson protester, is currently serving 8 years in prison, was 18 years old at the time of his arrest, and has not harmed one single person, while officers are allowed to murder us with impunity. 4, we envision a remaking of the current U.S. political system in order to create a real democracy where Black people and all marginalized people can effectively exercise their full political power. 5, we are calling for an end to the war against Black people. We demand an end to the criminalization, incarceration, and killing of our people. And lastly, 6, we call for reparations. Museums are nice, but they're not reparations and they're not freedom. The government, responsible corporations, and other institutions that have profited off of the harm they've inflicted on Black people, from colonialism to slavery through mass incarceration and surveillance, must repair the harm done. In closing, the United States government has a long history of telling other governments what to do, what human rights need to be protected, while violating the rights of Black people at home and being responsible for countless human rights violations around the world. Despite what our people in the United States and around the world are up against, I am more hopeful than ever, because I believe in the power of Black people. I believe the decade will support us in achieving what we must, which is why I joined so many here today in calling for a process whereby Black people, civil society, can have an opportunity to contribute meaningfully to the drafting process for the Declaration. I also must end in saying we must center Black voices, Black experiences, Black expertise when speaking to Black issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Tenjiwe, for that contribution to this discussion this morning. You have highlighted quite a number of important issues, including issues of access to social services for people of African descent, using the example of the United States, and also racialized law enforcement, and you have made 6 specific proposals, which I'm sure colleagues you will exercise your minds on those. Now, I will now turn to Ms. Verene Shepherd, who is a member of the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, to make a contribution. Verene, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. Greetings, brothers and sisters. I greet fellow members of the panel, and I thank the organizers for allowing members of the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination to participate in this very important meeting. CERD has a general recommendation on people of African descent, and therefore the situation of people of African descent is critical to the work of the CERD. But I speak today as a descendant of Alexander Mighty, my great-great-grandfather, who was born into slavery in Jamaica in 1829, but left at 5 years old at the time of emancipation in 1835 with nothing but freedom. I speak also on behalf of the people of the Caribbean, who over a century after emancipation are still struggling to achieve true political and economic independence and sustainable development, and poverty, and make the region less vulnerable to the ravages of natural and man-made disasters and the impact of climate change and centuries-old environmental degradation. While a multiplicity of strategies has been pursued by the Caribbean in its efforts to overcome socioeconomic, environmental, and political challenges, especially after gaining independence from Western European powers, as those powers left the region and underdeveloped after having used our resources with indigenous and forcefully imported labor to ensure its own development, reparation as part of decolonial justice for such underdevelopment has been placed on the table by the people of the Caribbean. However, Western European powers have refused to engage in any meaningful dialogue on the issue of reparation. Indeed, Europe's response to a letter sent to them by the chair of the CARICOM Prime Ministerial Subcommittee on Reparation, Honorable Frondel Stewart of Barbados, acting on behalf of the other members of the Prime Ministerial Subcommittee and heads of government and ultimately the people of the Caribbean, is that there is no case to answer. Former UK Prime Minister David Cameron reminded CARICOM of the UK's long-standing position that the British government does not believe that reparations are the answer. Spain suggested that it has done enough by contributing to the permanent memorial to slavery at the United Nations in New York, and through the Spanish Development Corporation has developed educational programs for schools that teach children and young people the history of Spanish presence in America, inclusive of the good and the bad aspects. And President Hollande stated that history cannot be erased, and it cannot be the subject of transactions at the end of an accounting exercise, which would be at all points impossible to establish. This is ironic, as emancipation in the Caribbean was made an accounting exercise to secure agreement. That total sum that ensured the agreement was 20 million, paid out on 800,000 people, the number left on 1st August 1834 out of the 5.5 million forcefully transported to the British Caribbean. The demand therefore remains active and is located within the 10-point action plan drafted by the CARICOM Reparation Commission and accepted by all heads of government of the Caribbean community. The plan is not framed as a financial payout, but as a development package, because the region believes it has a right to development and that the Maangamizi and colonialism in the Caribbean severely impaired the region's development options.
The particular focus of CARICOM is not only captured in the works of scholars like Walter Rodney and Eric Williams, who located the roots of Caribbean underdevelopment firmly in colonialism, but also in the expressions of our artists. In this verse from Slave Driver, the Honorable Robert Nesta Bob Marley wailed, "Every time I hear the crack of the whip, my blood runs cold. I remember on the slave ship how they brutalized the very souls. Today they say that we are free, only to be chained in poverty. But slave driver, the table is turned." The right to development is, of course, enshrined in the 4th December 1986 UN Declaration during its 97th plenary. The General Assembly, having considered the question of the right to development, decided to adopt the Declaration on the Right to Development. Articles 1, 3, 4, and 6 are instructive. According to the UN, the right to development is an inalienable human right by virtue of which every human person and all peoples are entitled to participate in, contribute to, and enjoy economic, social, cultural, and political development in which all human rights and fundamental freedoms can be fully realized. The right to development agenda is reinforced in the program of activities for the UN Decade for People of African Descent and in the Durban Declaration and Program of Action. Clause 18 of the DDPA emphasizes that, and I quote, "Poverty, underdevelopment, marginalization, social exclusion, and economic disparities are closely associated with racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance, and contribute to the persistence of racist attitudes and practices, which in turn generate more poverty," end of quote. Clause 158 of the DDPA recognizes that historical injustices have undeniably contributed to the poverty, underdevelopment, marginalization, social exclusion, economic disparities, instability, and insecurity that affect many people in different parts of the world, in particular in developing countries, and recognizes the need to develop programs for the social and economic development of these societies and the diaspora within the framework of a new partnership based on the spirit of solidarity and mutual respect. As Amartya Sen argued in his 1999 book, Development as Freedom, overcoming these socioeconomic problems is a central part of the exercise of development and of the process of ensuring that freedom that will otherwise fall at the feet of underdevelopment. The DDPA and the Program of Action or activities for the decade have suggested solutions, but these solutions are rather vague and non-binding and are framed within the context of what David Martin terms lexical colonialism, with insufficient emphasis placed on the recipient and not enough empowerment of the recipient to deal with the artifact being transferred. The post-independence demand for development with input from former colonial powers still continues, especially as nationalist leaders, anxious to capitalize on the prostrate condition of European nations after World War II, in Bruce Seeley's words, never pressed for compensation. On the contrary, the new nations founded with much hope face daunting economic challenges. Seeley quotes Ahmad and Wilkie, who noted, and I quote, "These nations soon began to realize that political freedom could not be construed as an end in itself, and that achieving it did not automatically ensure the social and economic well-being of their people." Sir Ellis Clark, who was the Trinidadian government's UN representative to a subcommittee of the Committee on Colonialism in 1964, had made this point in his statement, and I quote, "An administering power is not entitled to extract for centuries all that can be got out of a colony, and when that has been done, to relieve itself of its obligations by the conferment of a formal but meaningless because it cannot possibly be supported political independence. Justice requires that reparation be made to the country that has suffered the ravages of colonialism before that country is expected to face up to the problems and difficulties that will inevitably beset it upon independence. Europe's alternative strategy of handouts, of grants, and of overseas development aid, while welcome, they are not the answer. Repatriation and decolonial justice is the answer. Reparation payments allocated appropriately will likely have economically positive and statistically significant impacts on growth and development. The debt has not been paid. The accounts have not been settled. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Shepherd, for this very informative and rich contribution to our discussion, highlighting very important issues of reparation and the 10-point action plan coming out of the Caribbean, and also the nexus between issues of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and other related intolerances with the right to development agenda. I think that link is always debated in a number of fora that deals with issues of discrimination. And now, to complete my panel of people here present, you accept that it's a fairly balanced panel. Is Hilary Sobas, who is a human rights specialist with IACHR, as I indicated earlier, and a representative of the Special Rapporteurship on People of African Descent and Against Racial Discrimination. But you will, of course, accept that when it comes to matters of development, it is ladies who take the lead and they bear the brand. Wherever ladies take the lead in development, we develop. So there is the challenge, Hilary. So without further ado, I'll give the floor to Hilary.
All right, thank you very much, Mr. Moderator, Madam Chairperson. Greetings to my fellow panelists. Special greetings, of course, to Professor Vereen Shepherd. Believe it or not, despite the fact that I look older than her, Professor Shepherd, I was once a student of Professor Shepherd. Not a particularly good student. I confess that I gave her a bit of trouble, but I believe she has forgiven me by now. So I'm very, very grateful to be here with you today representing Margaret May Macaulay, who is a commissioner of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights and the rapporteur on the rights of people of African descent and against racial discrimination. She wasn't able to be here, so she sent me instead. So you'll have to, unfortunately, have to make do with me. I was once assigned to her rapporteurship for a few years, so I have, so this is a subject which is very near and dear to me. But anyway, I know that I'm speaking to an audience that may not know much about the OAS, the Organization of American States, or the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. So for those of you, so let me just give a brief introduction. The Inter-American Commission on Human Rights is an autonomous organ within the Organization of American States. The Organization of American States, in short, is like a mini United Nations. It's 35 member states comprising essentially the Americas, including, there are about three members of the OAS here today. I think Canada, the US, and I see Haiti too. Greetings to you. And so the Commission, which has been around since 1959, is responsible for promoting, protecting, and monitoring human rights in the Americas. And one of the tools of the Commission is a rapporteurship on racism, which has been around since 2005. And I might add that the rapporteurship was established to a large extent because of Durban. Durban was actually the catalyst. And more recently, since I'm going to be talking a little bit about economic, social, and cultural rights, we have just now established a special rapporteurship on economic, social, and cultural rights. And that's in keeping with the broad mandate to serve the diversity of states and peoples in the Americas. So I want to, because I don't have much time, I want to share with you an institutional and regional perspective on economic, social, and cultural rights and the theme of development in North America. Now, it's well documented that economic, social, and cultural rights, and indeed the right to development, is severely under threat in North America. I'd say particularly in the United States of America, as has been, as it was explained by my fellow panelist, Ms. McHarris. Now, the rapporteurship, and in fact the Commission, has done a lot to try to document this status quo and to urge states to take action. My rapporteurship, the one that I'm representing, has done so by its seminal report on the situation of Afro-descendants in the Americas in 2011. And more recently, the rapporteurship has brought focused attention on many of the themes of development and economic, social, and cultural rights through different mechanisms of the Commission, such as hearings. So, for example, last year we had a hearing on the right to water, the first ever in the United States. And this is, as perhaps many of you may know, is a very critical issue which affects Afro-descendants and other minorities disproportionately in the States. Now, in my remaining time, I just want to look very briefly at the nature of development as it, thanks, Makar, the nature of development as it relates to North America and to Afro-descendants. Now, I have to say that there's an irony to me, a paradox, that North America comprises countries that are among the most advanced in the world, but home to some of the most chronic underdevelopment as it relates to people of African descent. So development means different things. It means one thing for the person who holds to a kind of market-driven capitalist orthodoxy notion of development. It means something completely different for people of African descent who essentially have been used as tools for this illicit development and have not benefited themselves. In fact, I know that I benefited somewhat from my lessons with Professor Shepard, because I also have Amartya Sen in my included, and Amartya Sen, the brilliant theorist, talks about development as freedom. And one of the tasks of development, certainly as it relates to North America, is to focus on diminishing conditions that obstruct the unimpeded exercise of pursuing the life one chooses, and the other focus on opportunities of augmenting the variety of choices to allow the freedom to choose. And this is the problem, that the choices are limited. In fact, oftentimes they are absent. If you look at poverty, broadly speaking, in the United States, 14.8% of the population live in poverty. Similarly, 13.5% of Canada's population. I have to, since my time is going, I have to note that the working group of experts on people of African descent has done some excellent work in documenting the status quo as relates to both the US and Canada in terms of the economic underdevelopment and discrimination. The OAS and in fact the Commission have enshrined development and in fact economic, social, and cultural rights as part of its mandate. Certainly it's contained in our Charter, in our Declaration of Rights of Man, and most recently it's been included in our Inter-American Convention Against Racism, where Article 4 states that states undertake to prevent, eliminate, prohibit, and punish, in accordance with their constitutional norms and provisions of the Convention, all acts and manifestations of racism, racial discrimination, and related forms of intolerance, including denying access to any social, economic, and cultural rights. Now, my time is up, but I just want to make one final point, that unfortunately, North America is not part of the discussion or even part of this convention process. I don't mind, I'm sorry to say, United States and Canada, that you both pulled out of negotiations on the convention and have refused, essentially, to be part of the process. I will say that despite that, I'm happy to say that the convention, which was adopted by the OAS in 2013, just came into force on November 11, when it was ratified by Uruguay. So it's now in force, it's one step forward. I think we're still not, we've always been a bit of a dialectic, where we're resisting, the current paradigm, which the current paradigm of development, which is very market-driven, as opposed to one which is more people-driven. Thank you so much, Chair. I know I went over my time. My apologies.
Thank you, Hilaria Sobas, for your intervention, which did highlight the nature of development as it affects Afro-descendants in North America and I think the Americas in general. And also this notion that is really a favorite of mine, the notion of development as freedom. I think that it's quite an important highlight. Wherever there is development, then you remove all these other issues which are related to racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and the other related intolerances. Now we have come to a stage where we will now watch a video by Tendai Achume, whom, as I said, is the new special rapporteur on contemporary forms of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance.
And gentlemen, it is a great pleasure to address you today for the first time as Special Rapporteur on contemporary forms of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance, a tenure which I assumed earlier this month. I'm deeply honored to have been appointed to this important mandate and to contribute to the discussions in the context of the Decade for People of African Descent. Thanks to the International Decade and its pillars, recognition, justice, and development, issues of racism, racial discrimination, and xenophobia against people of African descent have found their way on the agenda of various stakeholders. Nevertheless, inequality and racial discrimination against people of African descent remains a major obstacle to achieving development in many countries across the world. My mandate has frequently underlined that people of African descent continue to be marginalized and discriminated against in the enjoyment of their civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights, especially in the areas of education, employment, health, housing, property, and land. As stated by the Durban Declaration, there is a clear link between poverty and racism. One of the reasons why people of African descent are often among the poorest segments of society and remain trapped in poverty is the perpetual exclusion and discrimination they experience in their access to basic services and education. Women and girls of African descent are particularly affected as they face multiple forms of discrimination on the basis of their descent and gender. I reiterate that respect for human rights, equality, non-discrimination, inclusiveness, and participation are crucial in moving forward. They are also central to the realization of the Sustainable Development Goals of people of African descent. I encourage all relevant stakeholders to take seriously the vow of the 2030 Agenda to leave no one behind, as I am convinced that its goals cannot be achieved unless racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance are adequately addressed in its implementation and follow-up. In addition to anti-discrimination legislation, I encourage states to consider the development and effective implementation of specific strategies, action plans, and programs aimed at advancing the economic and social development of people of African descent. in collaboration with other relevant stakeholders. I particularly encourage states to take further measures for their empowerment, including through training, capacity building, and improve access to quality and higher education without discrimination based on any grounds. Enabling people of African descent to actively participate at all levels of decision-making is essential to overcome structural discrimination and to ensure their place as key actors in the development of countries. I would also like to highlight the importance of improving the collection of disaggregated data for combating the socioeconomic vulnerability of people of African descent. Such data is a prerequisite for developing and effectively implementing targeted interventions designed to improve the realization of their economic and social rights. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, let me assure you that I am committed to continue the work done by my predecessor with regards to promoting the important agenda of the International Decade. I will spare no efforts in fulfilling my obligations as Special Rapporteur, giving voice and greater visibility to all victims of racial discrimination, racism, xenophobia, and related intolerance, including people of African descent. Thank you for your attention, and I wish I could be there in person. Thank you.
We are, of course, grateful to Tendai for that message to this conference. She did highlight the issues that I think are familiar to most of you of the link. I think it's been highlighted most of this morning, the link between poverty and racism and the need for us. I think this is something that we've engaged in my ad hoc committee, need for disaggregated data, which then shows us where we are and what we need to improve. And of course, she also did highlight the important message that is coming through the SDGs, that we should leave no one behind, and we really have to mean it, that we leave no one behind. We now enter the period where we are going to have the general debate. And the general debate this morning will take us to 1300 hours. I have a list here. If you don't have your chance by 1300 hours, don't worry, because we are going to continue the debate at 1500 hours until 1630. So those who are not, who don't fit within the time period for this morning's debate, you can speak in the afternoon. So I'll initially go by this list. And the first one on the list among the member states is Canada. I don't know if the colleague from Canada is here. Oh, there you are. Canada, you have the floor.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Thank you, Chairman, and I thank the panelists for their excellent and very interesting presentations. The topic of the International Development Decade shares key objectives of the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda, namely combating inequality. Racial discrimination often takes the form of poverty and exclusion. In Canada, social protection covers first and foremost the responsibility of provinces and territories, although the three orders of government do have a role to play in this. The Government of Canada provides direct financial support to Canadians through programs such as the Canadian Learning Bond, the Canadian Child Benefit, the benefit for old age and guaranteed income supplement, tax breaks for wages and student grants. We also pay transfers and grant programs through the Canadian Transfer for social programs inter alia in order to promote the acquisition of competencies and access to affordable housing, etc. On 22nd November, the day before yesterday, the Government of Canada presented its first national housing strategy and the investment of $40 billion over 10 years in various initiatives for building, refurbishing and repairing the affordable housing stock of Canada and ensure that the neediest Canadians do have access to housing. 25% of the funds from this initiative will be allocated to projects for women and girls. The national strategy is the largest investment in affordable housing in the history of Canada. Moreover, the commitment of the Government of Canada to developing a Canadian strategy for poverty reduction will help to support vulnerable Canadians, including victims of racial discrimination. Thank you.
Thank you, Canada, for your intervention. Before I move to civil society and other stakeholders, I don't know if there's any other member state that wants to speak who were not inscribed. I don't see any. So I will now proceed to civil society and other stakeholders, and I will now give the floor to AfroTac TV Cyber Nomads. AfroTac. Yes, AfroTac, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you very much for having me, Mr. Chair, Mr. Moderator. My name is Adeton Kupas Adebizi. I am president of AfroTac TV Cyber Nomads. And AfroTac TV Cyber Nomads started as a government initiative 2001. Since then, we continue as a non-budget NGO. I live in Berlin in an arts house, former squad, with 17 artists. And my approach today is that AfroTac TV Cyber Nomads notes the importance of cultural representation for positive self-identification. And therefore, I want to basically present a cultural festival that should go around the world and that has been celebrated in Berlin with political people and the society twice already. And it is the Black Berlin Biennale, No Fear of Content, No Amnesty on Genocide. Black Berlin Biennale is a collective organized by AfroTac TV Cyber Nomads. It is a participative project beyond individual interest. It is a platform that is pre-enacting, re-enacting, and it has a focus on academia, art, and media culture, incorporating writing, visual, and oral knowledge bases from within our communities. It addresses vertical as well as horizontal connections in the communities, approaching the triangle of intersectionality from a Black woman she-art perspective against sexism and racism, as well as class, that from the undercurrent of Western concept of nation and of who or may not participate in that construction. Black Berlin Biennale reunites the histories of becoming Black with our self-determined interventions into the mainstream and what is perceived as high culture. It creates a platform for content linked to becoming human and privilege for all interests of being defined from slavery. Though political activism and education can meet effective academic media intervention into a culture only when people of African descent communities are involved. The future is definitely not without us, because it cannot be about us without us. No amnesty on genocide. We need positive culture for positive future. There is much to do, and Germany needs to recognize its responsibility to give us the funds to do so. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Afrotac. And can I remind colleagues that we need to fit our interventions within the 2 minutes, which will allow all of us to speak. I now give the floor to each one, teach one. Each one, teach one. Yes, please go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. My name is Karen Taylor. I represent IOTO, Each One Teach One, which is a community-based organization for empowerment of Black people in Germany. At the heart of our organization is a collection of about 3,500 books by African descendant authors, which makes us the biggest library with content of people of African descent in Germany. We also expanded our work to youth work, where we empower our youth and our youngest population, Black population in Germany. I'm also a board member of ENA, which is the European Network Against Racism. I'd like to highlight 2 points. When we talk about development, we cannot address development without addressing the lack of data and scientific research in Germany. At the international level, many studies deal with racism against Black people. In Germany, however, the phenomenon has not yet received much scientific research. The image of a Black person is drawn by the media, which still mostly talks about Black people in the context of crime or illegal immigration, without recognizing the achievements and different struggles of the Black population in Germany. Something which is forgotten way too often, Black people have been in Germany for more than 500 years now. But without measuring and quantifying the extent of discrimination and inequalities Black people face in Germany, it becomes nearly impossible to tackle them effectively. Equality data can provide powerful tools against discrimination and exclusion, shedding light on the situation of Black people and other groups that are at risk of discrimination. In Germany, we still haven't moved past the perception of racism being an individual issue. That's why we are calling, and I mean the German delegation, we are calling for more data to measure discrimination in order to disclose the structural, deeply rooted racism within the German society. As my second point, I'd like to highlight the issues which are drawn to the youth. Due to our youth work, I have to highlight the issues the young Black population face in Germany. When it comes to our educational system, it is intolerable to which extent our students have to face institutional discrimination and exclusion by teachers, counselors, administrators, as well as other students, ranging from stereotyping to unduly placing children of African descent in desegregated, special and/or vocational educational schooling. We therefore demand to take steps to combat racism, individual and structural discrimination in the educational system. This should include providing vocational training on non-discrimination and diversity for school administrators and teachers, conducting independent reviews of grades and records of students of African descent being sent to special education, providing counseling, student mediation, and psychological service to students of African descent being victims of racism, ensuring legal consequences and sanctions on discriminatory behavior by teachers, counselors, administrators, and other decision makers, and institutional racism, ensuring fair representation of teachers and professors of African descent in leading positions, and as last, ensuring that the school curriculum teaches accurately and truthful on the transatlantic slave trade and colonialism. All these measures must be taken in a close cooperation with the Black civil society, because as the Anti-Genocide Coalition has stated, about us, without us, is against us. Thank you.
Thank you, each one teach one. I now give the floor to Sophie Della. Anybody here representing Sophie Della? Yes, Sophie Della, you have the floor.
My name is, good afternoon, let's see, what time is it? Yeah. Good day to all present. My name is Serelda Jackson, and I represent Sophie Della, that's an Afro-European women's movement. And I also want to address everybody as a member of the board of the National Forum for People, Civil Society, People of African Descent in the Netherlands. Besides all the points and the points of concerns that have been addressed thus far, I would like to make one point of order. Stop the crab pot mentality. Stop e kangreu. Stop the crab patu fasi. This is needed in order for us to truly succeed in collectively addressing the issues that we need to change. That's all I want to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Sophie Della. I now give the floor to Afro's Dutch Academica. Anybody? Yes, you have the floor.
Is it on? Yes, I think so. Okay. Thank you so much. So my name is Timnit Zerre. I speak to you on behalf of the Afro-German Academic Network, a network of students and professionals of African descent based in Germany. Since the proclamation of the Decade for People of African Descent, we, the German delegation, have made significant progress in advocating the recognition of people of African descent as a minority group being targeted by human rights violations, as well as constantly raising the awareness for the Decade of People of African Descent and its implementation. Now I want to point out some aspects concerning the development of people of African descent. We note with concern that studies have repeatedly proven the severe lack of social mobility in Germany. People of African descent are disproportionately affected by this immobility. This strengthens the underdevelopment of people of African descent over generations, restricting us to fully exercise our economic, social, political, and cultural rights. Therefore, we demand positive measures on all national levels to address and eliminate the disproportionate high rate of unemployment and precarious employment. We demand educational as well as empowerment programs for children and youth of African descent to effectively increase their access to higher education. We demand the implementation of strategic concepts and guidelines addressing structural racism on the job market by creating concrete measurable guidelines promoting diversity in the private sector as well as the state institutions. We note with concern that the full recognition and accreditation of university degrees obtained in African countries is lacking. Therefore, we demand the full recognition and accreditation of those university degrees, allowing people of African descent to fully access their rights for economic and personal development. The individual identities of people of African descent are complex. People of African descent face intersectional forms of discrimination. Therefore, we urge to take these intersections into account in developing inclusive approaches and mechanisms to improve the human rights situations of people of African descent. Civil society organizations are underfunded and face severe insecurities concerning the continuation of their work. We demand the long overdue recognition of the irreplaceable and much-needed voluntary community work of civil society organizations. We demand the structural and sustainable funding of civil society organizations, allowing them to professionalize their valuable continuous efforts, which would enable us, and by that I mean all of us here in this room, to widen the scope of our advocacy activities. People of African descent are disproportionately underrepresented in leading positions in the public and private sectors. Positive role models are important and have the potential to serve as counter-narratives to existing stereotypes. Therefore, we underline the importance of special measures for people of African descent, as well as empowerment initiatives, especially targeting children and youth of African descent. Thank you.
Thank you, Afro-Dutch Academica. I now give the floor to Manchester Metropolitan University. Manchester Metropolitan. There appears to be nobody in the room. Let's move on to Frantz Fanon Foundation. The wretched of the earth.
Oui, bon. I am there. Good morning. Mireille Fanon, Mendes France. I will speak on the behalf of the Frantz Fanon Foundation. Et je vais parler en français. And I'm going to speak in French. So I'd like to thank all the panelists for their various presentations. But I am rather concerned by one thing, because in the final analysis, we're talking about subdevelopment, countries that are in delay, but it's better to talk about misdevelopment. And we need to have the link between the people who are subject to racism and lack of development. In a number of countries, there's always the application, still the application of ideology and implantation. And when I talk about this ideology, the idea is to forbid access to the earth to people of African descent, and we can see that in Africa, in Chile, in Colombia, in Brazil. And it's also important to look at the basis of capitalism. What has engendered capitalism? Capitalism has led to exclusions. It was based on the implementation of a racial policy as a way of segregating humanity. And it is still this that we have to face. So if we want to redress development, first of all, we need to look at deconstructing the ideology of the policy of race, which was set up as a racial category. And we also need to deconstruct the very formula of domination. It's only thus that we can really redress lack of development, misdevelopment, and the way that people are excluded from sovereignty to food, right to share of their natural resources in their countries, and to be seen as separate type of human beings. And that is something that also questions the very concept of humanity, universality of that unit. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Frantz Fanon Foundation. I now give the floor to Padema, African Women Development Platform. Padema, you have the floor.
Merci.
Yes, thank you. Yes, I'm the chair of Padema. Padema is the platform for the development of African women in Portugal. It's 3 years since we adopted this decade, and the state and the government of Portugal has done nothing up till now in order to promote this decade. So I would like to speak on the situation in Portugal, which is getting worse, but the situation of African women, their situation is even more serious. In Portugal, political life is dominated by political parties, but most of the political parties does not include any promotion of African women in this activity. For instance, in the women's organizations of their parties, there is nothing to cover
the promotion of women for their accession to these parties. So the situation in Portugal is institutional, it's structural. In Portugal, there are only 80 women in parliament, and there are no African women, women of African descent in parliament. There are 32 women who are presidents or chairs in various municipalities, but none at all women of African descent. And after this decade of the United Nations, we have set up something to promote women. We have established links with UNICEF to do this as well. Why can't we set up an agency in the United Nations to promote our agenda? That remains an open question. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Padema, for your intervention. I now give the floor to Vivolet. I understand it's French. Vivolet. Vivolet, you have the floor. You have the floor.
Bonjour et merci de me donner la parole.
Yes, good morning. Thank you for giving me the floor. My name is Ramata, and I'm here to represent Vivolet, which is made up of a number of families representing police crime and crime in general in France. And therefore, I would like to give you a non-exhaustive list of the victims involved. Massardé, Telolio Laka, Traoré, Baba Traoré, Abouka Traoré,
Amadou Koumé, Louis Mendy, Feti Traoré, Yakou Sanogo, Mahamadou Marega, deuxième, Larami Samoura, Mouchin Seoli, Babacar Gueye, Bouna Traoré, Zied Bena, M. Boukrourou, M. El Yamni, M. Hajimi, M. Ziri, M. Diakité, M. Mbowole, M. Aïtomgar, M. Bourras, M. Madi, Madame Seba, M. Kaïf, M. Oussekine, M. Semoudi, M. Saoud, M. Gerdner, M. Ben Mahamar, M. Dieng, M. Zaouia, M. Thaïs, M. Bouziane, M. Manoka, M. Massoui, M. Fernandez, M. Iish, M. Amlaoui, M. Dem, M. Berichi, M. Agos, M. Mondésir, M. Brientos, M. Ben Mokhtar, M. Jou, M. Bilotet, et la liste est encore longue.
And it's a long list still. Unfortunately, I could spend all day just reading that list out. To tell you that black lives have no value in France, it's a state policy that leads to murder. When families decide to fight in order to obtain justice, they are criminalized by the French state and persecuted by the French state. Just an example, Théolio Accard, who was intimidated to such an extent that he had to issue an official pardon to the people who are victimizing him. There are 4 brothers in prison right now, and the murder of a child. This has been led by the French state simply on the basis that they demanded justice. We need to make sure that this decade of the United Nations should lead to the abolition of mass murder of people of African descent in slave countries, in Europe, in the United States, and in the Arab world. This decade must ensure that our values acquire a new value. Thank you very much for having heard me.
As I give the floor, thank you, Vievoli, for your intervention. As I give the floor now to the Geneva International Center for Justice, can I again remind colleagues to try and fit in your very important messages and interventions within the 2 minutes. The rate at which we are going, I can see that we may not be able to fit everybody into the time allocated, which is we should be ending this debate at 16:30. So please, if you can bear that in mind. Geneva International Center for Justice, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chairperson. Geneva International Center for Justice notes with deep concern the persistence and structural racism and racial discrimination across Europe and North America that put grave obstructions in the way of people of African descent towards growth and to their full potential. Not only do people of African descent have to work double hard to prove themselves consistently, to attain success and recognition, they are often traumatized due to past experience, which in turn inhibits their individual and collective development. With the adoption of the SDGs, states have pledged to leave no one behind and to prioritize the needs of the most marginalized and vulnerable of society. Still carrying the cruel legacy of the past, people of African descent often constitute the most marginalized of society. They experience deep-rooted institutionalized discrimination in all spheres of life, in education, health, employment, housing, etc. Yet, as we have heard in earlier interventions, national policies of the former colonial powers fail to address racism against people of African descent. To stand any chance of moving towards the SDGs, states must adequately address the specific challenges and risks faced by people of African descent in law and in practice, inter alia, through targeted health programs and adequate insurance schemes, through affirmative action to ensure equal access to and footing in the educational system, and employment in all occupational sectors, including government and law enforcement. Not only do the former colonizers deny African peoples full development in their own countries, they also extract, exploit, outsource, and pollute abroad, thereby hampering sustainable development in African states. We furthermore call upon those African governments that trample the freedoms and rights and scorn the needs of their people, instead engaging in rampant corruption. Seeing no way to develop themselves and their communities in their home countries, many are thus forced to leave. Geneva International Center for Justice holds that the prohibition of racial discrimination constitutes an erga omnes obligation. In other words, it is an overriding principle from which no derogation is permitted, and which is therefore binding. UN member states should make responsible and full use of their national legal system to achieve the most fundamental principles of equality and non-discrimination and enhance cooperation among each other towards this inalienable goal. Thank you.
Thank you, Geneva International Center for Justice. I now give the floor to the European Network of People of African Descent. European Network. Anybody representing the European Network? I don't see any in the room. We now move to the Women's Round Table. Women's Round Table.
Hello. We've been lied on and sicked on, spied on and whipped on, just for the right to live. We've been ravaged and raped and oh, how degraded, and yet we'd still forgive. When will my people learn? When will my people learn that we need a love revolution? We are our only solution. When will my people learn? My name is Latasha Brown, and I am a woman from the U.S. South, and I think it's important that we bring our whole, thank you, our whole and complete selves, thank you, to this space to honor the culture of who we are. In America, Black women show up. We're the fastest growing entrepreneurs. We enter college more than our counterparts. We have the highest voter turnout rate in America, yet between 2004 and 2014, Black women lost an annual net income of 5%. Why is that? Because of structural racism and sexism in the U.S. Currently, in Louisiana, Black women make 60% less than their white male counterparts doing the same exact job. Black women in Mississippi vote higher than any constituency constituency group in the United States, yet remain to be one of the poorest. We have witnessed the active dismantling of food, housing, and health programs that support women and vulnerable families, the attack of reproductive rights in the LGBTQ communities, seeing our sons terrorized and our daughters be thrown across the room in classrooms by grown white male cops. We've witnessed the increase of incarceration of black women and the expulsion and criminalization of black girls. The Black Women's Roundtable has identified 8 core areas around human development that we're calling for the U.S. to prioritize: access to quality and affordable health care, eradicating maternal mortality, end the school-to-prison pipeline, ensure equal economic and education opportunities, protect the rights of black women in the workplace, access to reproductive justice, reduce the violence against black women and girls, and quality affordable housing. Our priority should be on actual human investment and development, and focus on what is essential for the growth and development of those who have nursed, fed, and built the wealthiest country in the world through our toil, our pain, our sweat, our bodies, and our labor. Thank you in advance. Thank you for the opportunity to speak.
Thank you, Ratasha Brown, for representing Women's Roundtable and for that fine rendition. I now give the floor to Council de Communauté Africaine on Europe, on Belgique. You can tell that my French is not quite there, but is anybody representing this organization? Yes, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, moderator. Well, as in the case of yesterday, I am to a certain extent rather frustrated, and the concern that I want to share is something that I want us to question exactly how serious is our approach to this whole development topic. Now, why do I say this? Well, that's because it's for us here as organizations of civil society that we need to express ourselves very clearly 3 years after this decade was launched, and to say exactly what are the ways and means that we will put into effect in order to continue our progress towards a better situation for our communities. We want this to be very specific. What is the global budget that the United Nations envisages to allocate to nations in order to implement a policy of change so that the stereotypes change, so that the economies of black African communities can make progress? And we're talking about a continuity. This isn't a stop-and-start work that we're carrying out. This is work that is being specifically undertaken in the field. They are undertaking measures with very few means at their disposal to ensure that the mental state of those who are at the very edge, that this is taken into account, so that the hell that we have undergone one day is not simply paved with good intention. And so apparently the financial question is still under silence. This is something that is always tackled always at the very last possible time. Thank you. This has to change.
Thank you for that intervention. I now give the floor to Collectif des Femmes Africaines du Hainaut, RIFAD. Anybody representing RIFAD? I don't see anyone in the room. Let's now proceed to APP-HRC. APP-HRC?
Hello. I'm right here.
Please go ahead. You have the floor.
Thank you. My name is Tomiko Shine, and I'm a cultural anthropologist, and I founded the organization Aging People in Prison. We advocate for the release of elderly people in prison. I'm speaking to the platform currently, development. One of the things that has occurred as we have worked with people who are incarcerated in North America is that we have noticed also a corresponding trend of high illiteracy rates, computer literacy rates, and we've also seen where human resources are taken from the communities, and these are bodies that are held within the prisons for decades at a time. This has dismantled the black community, the black family. One of the things that I want to make note of that is I would like that this would be an opportunity for the decade to be more than just something celebratory, something more than just a token like a holiday or a postage stamp or a dollar bill or a mural or street name that has been given to people of African descent over the centuries. It's time now for the decade to begin to make a physical manifestation into civil society and in the black community. What I'm talking about is a type of implementation of the institutionalization of the decade of black people around the globe of African descent. What this would mean would be giving resources to the grassroots, to the civil society to begin to implement this physical manifestation. This is very important to institutionalize. In a culture, the family is the first institution. With people of African descent, this institution has been constantly disrupted and interrupted, whether through slavery, colonialism, lynchings, imprisonment. The institution has not been able to grow and thrive for the black family. One of the reasons this has occurred is Frantz Fanon talked about in his book about a racial jealousy. So we've had in the history of North America where whole cities, communities have been burnt down, dismantled, when people of color were doing well. Where migrations occurred in the South where they had to leave their land and millions of land was lost in the South. They were escaping white vigilantes. What this decade can begin to do by having the grassroots like people in this room, by giving them resources and beginning to construct some type of consortium, they're the ones that's in the field in the community that are going to do the work. No one else is going to do the work for people of African descent except people of African descent. Just like myself, we're an organization, we just don't work with the old, but we work with the young. We have a literacy program, an education program, but very few resources, like many of the people in the room. If they had not helped us, we wouldn't have been able to travel here. So one of the things, again, as I suggested, that we began the decade in the working group of African descent, look at building a consortium with the people in the room, give them the monies and the resources to begin to do the work and implement the physical manifestation of the decade within our communities around the globe.
Yes, yes.
Why should this be done? Because the children of Africa still cry out, and the mother of Africa cries out because her children were taken away from her centuries ago. And she has been treated, and the children, horrifically within these centuries of this time and space that we've been contained in as people of African descent. Our sons and daughters deserve a better narrative, a better future that has been locked down and locked out, as Langston Hughes calls deferred dreams. And as Dambisa Moyo in her book Dead Age says, we do not need handouts, but we need resources, because it is time to begin to rebuild. I foresee the next century going forward, and the decade can help with this, is that this be a century for people of African descent for repairing, healing, and rebuilding. This is my suggestion. I say it's in the name of our ancestors, Madiba, Shaka Zulu, Malcolm X, Patrice Lumumba, Ella Baker, Queen Nzinga, Maria Elena Moyana. I call up these ancestors to help us and to give you all the wisdom to help us with the resources to begin to rebuild the people of African descent for the next century going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, APPHRC. I now give the floor to Middle East African Diaspora Unity Council. Middle East African Diaspora. There appears to be nobody in the room representing Middle East African Diaspora Unity Council. I will now proceed to give the floor to Global African Congress UK. Global African Congress UK, please go ahead.
Greetings. People have talked about the United Kingdom and their refusal to talk about reparations. They've talked about the richest countries telling us that they don't really have to do anything more about reparations. It's our money. We raised that money from our blood, sweat, and tears as African people who were enslaved or put in prison and forced to work for cheap labour. All we're asking is for that, some of that come back to us, to help us to develop to the state where we would have been if we had not been taken from our country. We want it not just for ourselves in the diaspora, but for Africa. We want you to stop exploiting Africa and taking our resources and acting like we have nothing, that we're poor. We're poor because you continue to take from us, to steal from us. Britain has produced an audit of race equality. We've had a report recently on criminal justice system, the things that people are talking about, overrepresentation in prisons, underrepresentation in employment and political participation. We are seeing that all over the world for African people. Our countries have to come together and unite. We also want to be acknowledged as African people. In some countries, on the 1st of August, we actually stop and have an Emancipation Day march as African people. The UN could be part of the lobby to encourage our governments to make that a national holiday, an international holiday, so that all of us can march on the 1st of August and remember the contribution and the pain that Africans have suffered to make this world the place that it is. Yeah. We want our freedom fighters who were criminalized for fighting against enslavement to have their names cleared, and we want special measures that are allowed under UN conventions to be implemented.
Thank you, Global African Congress UK. I now give the floor to International Human Rights Association of American Minorities. Please go ahead. You have the floor.
Yes, Madam Chair, colleagues, brothers and sisters, to speak of development is to first recognize the prerequisites. First, to affirm equal political status, which have not been achieved in any of the places where people of African descent reside. In multinational states, through political subterfuge, national oppression is disguised and discussed as racism, currently being furthered by ethnic cleansing in every meaningful human activity, including education, housing, and employment. And this renders us, in fact, ready for entry into the prison industrial complex where we are already overrepresented. To speak of development is to recognize that justice can only be achieved by acknowledging the harms suffered by people of African descent due to slavery and colonialism, which can only be remedied by reparations. We speak of compensation, restitution, development, and a data collection monitoring system. Development cannot and will not be realized without removing the barriers well documented and substantiated by the many colleagues at this forum and years prior, starting with Du Bois in his Declaration of Genocide in 1953. It is our intention to assume the rights of all people, including the right of development, yet this cannot be done without addressing the mass campaign of ethnic cleansing that is rendering us further underdeveloped. Thank you very much.
Thank you, International Human Rights Association American Minorities. I now give the floor to National Monument Dutch Slavery Past. You have the floor.
Good morning. Good afternoon. Thank you, Chairman, for this opportunity. As I represent the Dutch Monument Slavery Past in the Netherlands, and as well the National Forum for Civil Society of People of African Descent in the Netherlands as well. I would like to make a few short observations. Over the last few general debates that we've had here with civil society represented from many countries, we've raised so far many common issues that are currently issues that we are facing. Yet the question is, why are these issues not being resolved? It's very interesting to see that no matter where we come from, we have a commonality within us, even though we come from different cultures and backgrounds and races. That's the first point. Second, the UN decade is beyond a doubt a good development. However, we are of the opinion, and I think many here with me, that it becomes richer and more comprehensive when we interweave the Sustainable Development Goals. The SDGs are directly linked with the living conditions and circumstances that need so much improvement within the community of people of African descent. From the right to good health care, to the freedom of expression, to being taken seriously when we lodge a complaint of racism, for example, within the judicial systems in our home countries. Lastly, I would also like to observe that if the civil society wants to organize itself, we must be allowed the possibility to do so. Now, in most countries, we do have this right of collectivism, but oftentimes within government systems, within the administrative cycle, we get different kinds of obstacles that we have to face. I would like to close by saying that it is really great to be here and hear the different issues and network with different organizations from many other countries. But the the UN decade will need to go forward in a collective movement, not only in respect to your own country, but cross-border as well. Thank you.
Thank you, National Monument Dutch Slavery Past. I understand that Manchester Metropolitan University is now in the room, so I'll proceed to give the floor to Manchester Metropolitan University. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairperson, and good afternoon to everyone. Many thanks to the regional meeting for allowing me to share some of my recommendations with you this afternoon. My name's Ornette Clennon, and I've spoken before, and I'm an academic from Manchester Metropolitan University, but I'm also a scholar activist from the grassroots organisation Making Education a Priority. So, in the UK, the work of grassroots organisations often remains invisible, and I'd like to lay out the case for the need of stronger working group reporting mechanisms for grassroots organisations. So these organisations are usually run on a shoestring budget, relying on volunteers, in so doing facing challenges for funding and sustainability. Grassroots social enterprises are usually very small, ranging from micro enterprises of just 1 or 2 people up to small and medium. Sorry, I'm just going to turn the volume down.
Yeah, I was going to say if you can turn down the volume of your earpiece.
Yeah,
there's some feedback.
I've done that, yes. So grassroots social enterprises are usually very small, ranging from micro enterprises of just 1 or 2 people up to small, medium enterprises employing perhaps 10 or more. So because of their size and their structures, grassroots organisations often do not have formal relationships with statutory agencies, despite delivering many of their services informally. However, they do have an intimate local knowledge of their communities that allows them to cater for the specific needs of their localities. In contrast to many civil society organisations, grassroots organisations tend to be embedded in their local communities because their members are often native to their localities and continue to live and work there. So my point today is that we really need to find a way of reporting their outputs within the context of the SDGs so that auditing their work uses the same metrics as the larger CSOs and statutory agencies, because this will enable us to better identify their outputs within the national big data sets. So to house my suggestions for grassroots community reporting, the UN should support the formation again, of an international civil society and grassroots network for people of African descent with an online platform. And amongst other items, this platform should include a searchable international database on CSOs and grassroots organizations with information about the organization, their interests, contact information, and crucially, their SDG mapped community reports. Thank you.
Thank you, Manchester Metropolitan University. I now give the floor to Middle East African Diaspora Unity Council. You have the floor, sir. You have the floor. Microphone.
Is it on? Thank you. I'm so sorry. My name is Dr. Minister Ben Yehuda. I represent the hundreds of thousands of African people who are living in the modern state of Israel. The community that I live in are engaged in an effort to bring these unique African communities together under a unified and holistic working agenda. We're working with the African Bedouin community, the Ethiopian community, the Eritrean community, the African asylum seekers of Israel, and also the African Palestinians who are living in the Palestinian region in that land. Excuse me. My statement is to each of the serious African people in this room, and that is the challenges that we all fight against is white supremacy. White supremacy is a systemic ideal and institution that justifies and promotes the exploitation of non-white people for sustaining the Caucasian world. And when you think about it, and this is a very serious point, our grandfather's grandfather made presentations like we're making today. Our grandfathers have made these presentations, and many of our fathers have made these presentations. My question to you in this room, what makes us believe that our children and grandchildren will not be making these same type of presentations? My point, we have to do something very radical and very passionate to remove the challenges among our people. And that is, we have to stop participating in their agenda. We can never receive the type of justice and equity under the European system of governance and culture. We must have the audacity, the courage, and the passion to stop participating in their world and rebuild our own. Thank you.
Thank you, Middle East African Diaspora Unity Council. I now give the floor to the next group on my list, which is Tapepuka. And this acronym, in my native language, I don't know whether it's accidental or it's deliberate, means we have woken up, and how apt. Tapepuka, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairperson, for affording me the opportunity. And you are quite right. It means we've awoken, but in this sense we have reawoken. We are saying African people were already awake when they were where they were, but through the process of migration, they've lost a lot of capital and they have to re-understand the situation that they find themselves in, and now they've understood. I've already introduced myself, and I've already introduced Tapepuka, which works with African migrants in the north of England, and it is African-led. I believe that part of development for people of African descent is giving legitimacy and resources to grassroots organizations that work directly with affected communities, that have their trust, and that speak their languages. In the UK, where I work, there are initial accommodation centers for migrants. And I'm refusing to categorize or compartmentalize migrants because I find it very divisive to call asylum seekers, refugees, immigrants, born here, born there, enduring devastating conditions, including inadequate sanitary facilities, poor diets, and withholding of warm clothing and other things that are needed in people who are in distressful situations. And as a result, they suffer physical, mental, and psychological abuse from being in those initial accommodation centers. And yet, grassroots organizations like Tapepuka are refused entry to these accommodation centers. We are denied the opportunity to provide vital support to these people in the times of their greatest need. I urge the United Nations to make firm recommendations to member states and to stop the violation of rights and dignity of new migrants in accommodation centers. I also ask for the UN to support people of African descent-led organizations, grassroots organizations in particular, providing vital support to migrants through making available resources and through creating an international network of people of African descent organizations. This way, we can ensure the growth of organizations like my own, Tapepuka, who are working with most affected on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you, Tapepuka. I now give the floor to Youth Against Racism. Youth Against Racism.
Excellencies, friends, brothers, and sisters of the world, it is time for a youth summit against racism. Let it be included in the official records that the organization I'm here to represent, Youth Against Racism, is imploring this regional meeting, the second International Youth Summit Against Racism. As some of you will know, and some of you may remember, at the WCAR in Durban, we had the first International Youth Summit Against Racism, which brought together 300 young people and young leaders from around the world to make a difference in the fight against racism, against xenophobia, and related intolerances, which I might add includes discrimination based on age. It was a triumph, an astonishing success, a remarkable feat, one that would pave the way for an international mobilization of young people and young leaders in the combating and hopefully eradicating racism once and for all. But that was not to be. September 11, 2001 happened. And shortly after the summit, all of the momentum that young people and young organizations such as Youth Against Racism had built was dissipated. Youth Against Racism participated in the Durban Review Conference and has lobbied the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights for the past 5 years in order to get approval for the follow-up Youth Summit Against Racism. We are here today, once again, to act as the last and final voice of the young. Let our voices be heard. Once again, let us reinforce Durban Declaration and the Program of Action Article 138, which dictates to the involvement of youth and youth organizations in the process of the United Nations. An article Youth Against Racism, in fact, helped to include in the DDPA in 2001. Let us not turn our back to the Durban youth and begin the process of approving, officially recognizing, and organizing the much-needed follow-up International Youth Summit Against Racism. It is time. Thank you.
Thank you, Youth Against Racism. I now give the floor to Lecran. Please followed by Platform Afro.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I'd like to speak on behalf of the Representative Council of Black Associations of France and mention some very worrying developments. I'd like to tell you about the sale of black Africans as slaves in Libya. As you know, the black people of France were the first to denounce these abuses against our African brothers. We continue to sign petitions and organize demonstrations such as that to be held tomorrow before the French embassy to say that what is happening in Libya is only the tip of the iceberg. There are other African countries and Gulf countries which have slavery in one form or another, and we have to denounce them and impose sanctions. These tragedies are unfortunately linked to lack of development in African countries and lack of a future in terms of education and jobs for many young Africans. We have to discuss our own continent. When we discuss African descent, we have to understand Africa and wish for its development and eradicate practices from long ago. And we have to do this as members of the diaspora. This is the International Decade for People of African Descent. How can we become better involved to help civil society to make progress and win battles for the freedom of our African brothers and sisters who are alone facing governments which are not helping them? Thank you.
Thank you, Lecra. I now give the floor to Platform Afro, followed by Kwanzaa Association. Platform Afro. We don't appear to have somebody from Platform Afro in the room. Kwanzaa Association. Kwanzaa Association, please go ahead. Microphone. Your microphone is off, Kwanzaa.
Buenas tardes. Mi nombre es Ngoy.
Good afternoon. I'm Ngoma. I'm African Spanish descent. I'd like to stress, first of all the progress made in the African Spanish community through political, artistic, cultural, and student and academic organizations. For many years, we've pursued a philosophy of struggle, unity, and resistance, and we have made headway in areas previously prohibited for black men and women. Nevertheless, despite civil society organization, the Spanish government doesn't listen to us. It turns its back on us. They are not interested in our development, and they do not recognize the existence of an African community in Spain. They are not interested in legal development. They are only interested in a democratic state for some and a police state for others. The Spanish government isn't interested in economic and social development because it doesn't recognize that the African population has today created in Spain over 20,000 companies providing work for more than 55,000 people. Their discourse is that African men and women are taking away resources from the Spaniards. The Spanish government is not interested in our development because they do not recognize African movements and tries to make them invisible. They are hiding and concealing the African history of Spain. They do not recognize the challenges of development. There are over 7,000 African teachers without jobs. The Spanish government does not recognize the fact that they are closing borders to thousands of people in the south of Spain. When we apply to the current context the fact that 15 people are being killed at the border in Tarajal, this means Hitler isn't dead. When we see that we are imprisoning over 20,000 people of African descent, this means that they have deceived us. When people are detained or because of their ethnic or racial profile, this means that Hitler isn't dead, and that was a poem with which I concluded my statement. Thank you.
Thank you, Kwanzaa Association. And I will now give the floor to the last group to speak during this segment, which will be Black Mamas Matter Alliance. Black Mamas Matter Alliance. Please go ahead.
Good afternoon. I'm Elizabeth Dawes-Gay, and I'm here on behalf of the Black Mamas Matter Alliance. The Black Mamas Matter Alliance envisions a world where Black mamas have the rights, respect, and resources to thrive before, during, and after pregnancy. That vision is a long way off because the United States has a serious problem. The U.S. is a place where Black mothers are allowed to die at disproportionately higher rates than white mothers, where Black children can be shot down by police with impunity. The same ideology that permits violence perpetrated against our children in our communities is the same ideology that has allowed Black mothers to suffer from and die from pregnancy and childbirth unnecessarily. The murders of Black people at the hands of police and domestic terrorists is one of the most hostile ways we observe racism in our country. But the persistent and perpetual devaluation of Black lives is also seen in how systems limit our access to health care, education, healthy food, right to a living wage, right to justice, and our right to clean water. In the public health world, these factors such as education, employment, income, safety, discrimination, political power are known as social determinants of health. Where we live, how we live, and how we are treated matters a great deal for our health, and maternal health is no exception. While access to health care is highly important, it simply isn't enough. We know that Black women who have financial and physical access to quality health care are still more likely than white women to have adverse pregnancy outcomes. Maternal mortality and morbidity among Black people is, at its core, tied to the experience of living while Black in the United States. Yet, some people have the nerve to blame our health outcomes on us, and not on the social, physical, and political environment in which we live. They say it's because we are too obese, or because we have diabetes and high blood pressure before becoming pregnant, or because we access prenatal care later than we should. They say that if we just did better, we wouldn't have the problems that we have, but they don't acknowledge that the disproportionately high rates of chronic disease in the Black community are a result of centuries of systemic oppression and social injustice that has denied and still denies Black people equal access to all of the resources we need to be healthy. The story isn't just that Black people must do better. The story is that the United States must do better.
Yes.
With that, I call on the United States government to take action to address the issues under the theme of development. Specifically, I request that the U.S. policy environment ensure that Black people in the U.S. have adequate housing, transportation equity, nutritious food, clean water and environments free from toxins, fair treatment within the criminal justice system, safety and freedom from violence, and a living wage and equal economic opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Black Mamas Matter Alliance. Like I indicated, the other speakers will now have to speak in the afternoon. And for your information, these are echoing IDA or IDA, Afro Empowerment Center Denmark, Commissions of the Churches on International Affairs of the World Council of Churches, Vetersen das Schweiz, that's Switzerland, Institute for African Studies, COTTARM, Community of Originals of Afro-Asian Countries in the Republic of Moldova, then Comitato 3 Ottobre, and then there are other, just two groups, I think, that didn't have the chance to speak earlier in the day because they were not in the room. I don't know if they will be available. That's European Network of People of African Descent and RIFAD. If they will be available in the afternoon, they can speak. Then just two other announcements to say there is going to be a general space discussion towards provision of effective remedies and reparatory justice, which will be moderated by Vereen Shepherd, who was with us here, who is a member of the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, SED. And this will take place in room 27. I think it is there on your, for the younger ones who may not have gone through Roman numerals, that is the room that will be indicated as XXV11 or VII. That's 27. The next announcement is to do with the, really a reminder that there will be an expert meeting addressing racial stereotypes of people of African descent at Palais Wilson here in Geneva, of course, on Saturday and Sunday. This is over the weekend, and that copies of the program can be found on the tables at the back of the room. And also to just remind you, if you could please sign up if you'd want to participate on the list of speakers, which is also on the left of this room, to my left, that is. So thank you very much. We resume at 3 o'clock in the afternoon.